Hi, and thanks for joining us for this session, Key Differences Between Next Generation Science Standards and Curriculum. My name's Francis Vigent. I am a former teacher myself, high school and elementary and middle school, as well as the founder and CEO of KnowAtom. KnowAtom is based just north of Boston, and we've been in existence for almost 12 years now. So to kind of kick off our webinar on the differences between standards and curriculum, specifically as they relate to the next generation science standards, whether you're from an adaptive state or an adoptive state, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. If you are on the live session, I'd like you to know that you can ask questions. There is a question panel that'll be on your screen. Feel free to drop questions in there anytime. And one of my colleagues, Karen, is with us on the session and will either field questions to me or will do her best to answer those for you in real time. As we go through this discussion, I think it's important to think about our agenda in the bigger picture. If you kind of boil it all down, we teach 100% of children science and engineering, but only 3 to 4% actually go on to be scientists and engineers. So there has to be a significant reason for science standards, whether it's just the standards, or if you think about science class, to exist for 100% of all students. And for myself as an educator, and as our organization KnowAtom views it, it's really about teaching critical thinking skills. It's about helping children develop creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking that is really best taught through science and engineering, because scientists seek to answer questions, and they do so through experimentation, and engineers identify and solve problems, and do so through prototyping and testing. And so when you think about that, that experimental environment is really what the next generation science standards are all about. It's about creating that environment, and with the purpose not of making every child a scientist or an engineer, but with the purpose of helping every child develop critical thinking skills. And the idea that those critical thinking skills are skills that are important for all disciplines and for all careers and for any kind of higher education or technical training program, certificate program that a child might want to go on to. So with that in mind, I want to just kind of lay out the agenda. First is to kind of talk a bit about what these standards are, some of the key shifts. Secondly is to talk about how this, this new set of standards takes the form of curriculum and then an actual instructional environment. And then what does it really mean to have mastery level curriculum, and how do we go from that classroom environment to student learning outcomes, and really what are the expectations for evidence of learning under these new standards. So that's an awful lot of ground to cover, but we'll do our best. Again, if you're on the live session, please drop your questions in the panel as we go along. We'll be keeping an eye on those. If you have to leave early or something comes up, please email your questions over. At the end of this, there will be a panel where we share email addresses. Also, you can go on KnowAtom.com and contact us that way as well. If you need a PD certificate, you can reach back to Karen. I'll give you her information at the end, also through the KnowAtom.com website. So here we go. One of the first things that you should do, if you haven't done it already, this is kind of a footnote mention that we want to start on, is it's very important for you to invest time in discovering the intentions behind the new standards. And that's true whether your standard adopted the new standards wholesale, just the way they appear, or whether your state has made some adaptations. Even if you're from an adaptive state like Massachusetts, West Virginia, those adaptive changes are adaptations to something that was a system of standards that exists in 3 dimensions. And it's very important that you understand its origins. Specifically, you should take a look at the front matter, as well as the Appendix A and Appendix H when you go to nextgenerationscience.org/get-to-know, and those hyphens are necessary. Okay. In starting kind of what is these, what are these new standards and how do we get from those standards to evidence of learning? I want to unpack one of these appendices quickly, which is Appendix H, which is the nature of science and engineering itself. The nature of science and engineering under next generation science standards is going to force a major change in most classrooms. Any classroom that was approaching science as knowledge, as a set of facts that a student needs to understand, is going to need to vastly reshape the nature of science that's been taught in that classroom. What I mean by that is that under the new standards, science is knowledge from experimentation, but the standards are really aimed at helping children develop the disposition, the skills, and the knowledge in order to engage in asking questions and developing and using their knowledge with their skills to answer those questions independently, and so produce scientific knowledge. You might say, well, what does that mean? Students are going to be curing diseases in the classroom, and that's not the expectation of the standards. What the expectation of the standards is that students will be able to develop and use content, will have developed skills, and will be able to apply both in a novel context. So if you are from a state that is engaged in park assessments, for instance, or Smarter Balance, any kind of ELA performance-based assessment at a state level, what you'll realize in an ELA context or in a reading context is that students are now being required to analyze scenarios and to demonstrate their skills and their knowledge in a novel context. That is what's come to science. If you're in the District of Columbia, if you're in Illinois, or if you're in one of the few other states that have either gone operational with next generation standardized testing or are within that 3-year window, this is what you're either seeing now or will see within that next couple of years. Engineering is unique. Science is also unique. So scientists, ask and answer questions through experimentation. Engineers identify problems and try to solve those problems by proposing a prototype approach. And by developing that prototype out, testing it, and then using the evidence of that test to form a conclusion. So engineers solve problems by using their knowledge of science. That's why in the new standards it talks about engineering applications of science. And so engineers produce new technology. Math is at the center of it all because it's a tool for communication. It is how scientists and engineers quantify not only their approach, but also their outcomes and communicate those. So math is a tool for communication for both scientists and engineers. By the way, engineers don't just build things. We're not talking about things that are physical. Sometimes engineers will design things that are physical, but they also design things that are non-physical, like software, like quality control processes in factories and so on. So the standards themselves, when you think about this nature of science and engineering that I was saying you ought to review in depth in Appendix H, it forms a kind of cycle of innovation, and that's why when you look at the new standards, they are actually performance expectations. They are not standards like the old standards used to be. Identify sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rock. Okay, that's not a performance expectation that you would find in the next generation science standards. You'll notice that this performance expectation is expecting students to be able to develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. That's a 5th grade level standard, life science standard. The key here, though, is that students who demonstrate understanding can do this. and they can do it in a novel context that is not the result of direct instruction. And in order for a student to have developed that understanding, or I might even say ability or proficiency, means that they have mastered this in the context of these three dimensions. The practices dimension, which is the skills dimension, disciplinary core ideas, which are the interconnected concepts that are necessary, knowledge or really understanding. There's a difference between knowledge and understanding. It's really understanding of these disciplinary core ideas is required so that they can be developed and used with the practices. And a student must also be able to connect different elements of these disciplinary core ideas through the way that they behave in nature. So here it's talking about that a system can be described in terms of its components and how those components interact. Okay, so if you think about describing the movement of matter among plants, animals, and decomposers in the environment, we're talking about food chains and food webs which interact, but we're also talking about producers, consumers, and decomposers and so on that are using energy, converting energy, and also playing a role in the transfer of matter. So I say all of this because this is not, for most states, this is not the standards that you used to teach. And if you were not teaching your former standards in a method which pulls skills, content, and systems behavior together so that students are learning to perform certain expectations, not in isolation, but actually in conjunction with other performance expectations in your classroom, you are going to have to think about how you translate these new standards into curriculum. In order to do that, it's really important that you understand those three dimensions and the structure of these standards, and I would refer you to this link again, nextgenerationscience.org/get-to-know, and look at the structure document as well as appendices E, F, G, and I in order to really unpack each of these three dimensions. It's much more than we could do even in an 8-hour day, so I don't want to spend too much time on that here in the webinar. But what I will do is just mention that the practices dimension is one where I think teachers are most challenged, because under content standards, most teachers have become familiar with sedimentary, igneous, metamorphic rock or food chains and food webs. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that they have not become familiar or taught these in a model where students have learned to ask questions and define problems independently, or to be able to develop a model independently and then use that model that they created to carry out an investigation or really plan the investigation from scratch themselves. And so the things that you see here in blue are things, all of these things are required of students, but the things that you see in blue are things that classrooms are particularly challenged with because of the former standards and the mode of instruction that was more or less acceptable under those former standards, because the standards were being tested in a very rote recall sort of sense. So a student under the new standards needs to be supported in the curriculum to be able to argue from evidence, to have learned that skill and have demonstrated it, to construct an explanation on their own, design a solution, think in terms of mathematics, but also computationally analyze and interpret data. The thing here, though, is that don't think of this as a checklist, like today we ought to develop a model. In fact, these are things that happen simultaneously as students are scientists and engineers. And so it's really important to picture your classroom as a place where there's a full release of responsibility, and your curriculum is translating what you see here in 3 dimensions into a 3-dimensional environment that's challenging students to plan, develop, ask these questions, analyze the results of their plans, argue from the evidence that they've gathered, and so on, really authentically. So why these standards, kind of connecting back to my opening comment, are connected to higher order thinking skills really has to do with creating, evaluating, and analyzing happening simultaneously. I think many folks under the prior standards tried to climb Bloom's taxonomy from the bottom up. And in reality, these new standards are focusing on higher order thinking so that classrooms are challenging students to create, evaluate, and analyze, and by doing so, it requires remembering, understanding, and applying. Because to only focus on those lower order thinking skills or try to climb that way, it's insufficient. And it's actually a very difficult way to reach mastery over the course of a school year. So keep that in mind, that this next generation curriculum and inquiry environment is really about creating, evaluating, and analyzing full-time with a full release responsibility, which really brings me to, what is curriculum? So curriculum is really something that exists at a district level, and it answers two key questions for educators. Number one, what is K-8 or K-12 or pre-K-12 science and engineering, September through June? How is it intentionally nurturing and integrated with the other disciplines? And what does the student experience look like? And the reason that I put these questions out there as sort of the foundation of what district curriculum answers is that it's what allows teachers to be supporting their peers. If these questions don't have the same answer, then a third grade teacher is not supporting a fourth grade teacher. The fourth grade teacher is not supporting the fifth grade teacher. And in fact, even within a year, one third grade classroom does not support another third grade classroom if there's any form of transience in your school district, or if there is a situation where there are latecomers, because that's part of intentionally nurturing students, is that you don't have a standard occur in one grade level and it's once and done. Folks are under, there's a lot of consultants that are out there that have never taught under these standards, that have never, or similar standards, and don't have sort of experience working across a lot of different environments. And so, the way that they are interpreting district curriculum is the way that the old standards used to allow for. Here's your vocab, here's the kind of concepts you need to cover, do it whenever, 3 units a year is sufficient, and that's just not the case under these new standards. There's a need for that curriculum to develop a student experience. So when you think about district curriculum, what its job is really to bridge between the standards, those next generation standards, and the next generation learning environment, which is that student experience. So the difference here is between that traditional model I keep referring to, where under prior standards and even educator preparation programs, that content was always thought to flow through the teacher, and the teacher would be the expert. They'd model the facts, they'd explain what everything is, they'd tell students what they need to do, and the student, being a good student, would repeat the facts, recall the demonstration, summarize the phenomenon, and that was it. So if a student could mirror back to the teacher what the teacher had shown or told, they were an A+ student. They were proficient. That's different, though. With these new standards, there is a new definition of effective STEM instruction. It really redefines what an acceptable student experience is. And it's a shift from what you see in the picture on the left to what you see in the picture on the right. You see, this is the National Research Council's definition that is sort of at the basis of all these new standards. It's that effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences. So it's starting in pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, and following students all the way along. It's identifying and building on what they know, so that means it's intentionally nurturing, and it provides them with the experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. So the practices of science, this is a very deliberate word choice. It's what we were talking about here. It's engaging students in developing their own models and planning their own investigations and analyzing their own data. That's why you see pictures like this of students who have not, had a teacher show them what to do and then kind of go back and try to do that over again for themselves, but actually be challenged and engaging and developing and using the content maybe from the nonfiction reading and Socratic dialogue to then work as partners, develop their own idea to try and solve a problem that they've identified and carry out that testing, gather the data, and form an evidence-based conclusion. And that's where our ELA claim evidence reasoning model of writing comes in. So that new definition of effective STEM instruction really gives us this new model of inquiry instruction, and this is true from pre-K all the way through grade 12. The role of the teacher is not the content expert. It's not the sage on the stage handing out facts and doing things first so that everybody else knows what to do and can go back and repeat it for themselves. Nobody learns any skills in that environment. And it's also, in that kind of environment, nobody learns a framework for all of the systems and the connections between content. So what happens in this next generation model is the teacher plays the role of skillful coach, and in fact is far more valuable in the learning environment, because what they're doing is they are helping children understand how to engage appropriately. They are acting to redirect and monitor the students as the students try to take on that role of scientist and engineer, and the teacher's helping to gradually adjust the supports for the students. So this is in essence scaffolding, but you have to be very careful. The role of supports and the role of scaffolding is not to remove challenge, it's to remove barriers. Okay, and to make sure that the challenge is appropriate and to continually adjust those so that the challenge remains. And that's what rigor really is in a next generation model of instruction, that next generation science class. Okay, so curriculum is centered around supporting every element of this. The teacher as the skillful coach, the student as the one who's developing the science and engineering practice skills, and the content, those disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts as the fabric that students reshape and develop and experience and actually begin to connect in that classroom. And so the expectations around students in this next generation model of inquiry is not rote recall. In fact, it's developing and using the content. It's acting as scientist or engineer to solve problems and answer questions, and it's to actually connect the content with its behavior and look for dynamic interactions. So back to that example of food chains and food webs, you know, it's not enough for a student to be able to know what a food chain is or a food web is, to have made one before, to be able to see, you know, a food chain on the board and tell you that it's a food chain, or to be able to see a rabbit and tell you that it's a herbivore. Okay, what a student needs to be able to do is to look at an image, you know, look outside the classroom window and to be able to say, well, you know, all of these plants and animals are able to live because the sun is giving energy to the plants are transforming that energy with the, you know, air and soil into matter that the rabbit that I see out there can consume as food and actually provides for them to be able to grow. And so we have a bit of a food chain here. And then, in fact, if we think about the foxes and the coyotes and other animals and plants, we actually have food web that's going on because there's multiple food chains, things that are eating the rabbit that's eating the plants. And so if we were to remove the plants or to remove the rabbit, we would actually have a cause and effect on this ecosystem, because all of these food chains and food webs actually form an ecosystem and they have dynamic interactions. So that's a next generation model understanding. Okay, a traditional understanding is a rabbit is a herbivore. Okay, a food chain starts with a plant and then an animal that eats an animal, you know, and so on. That's the old world understanding. So that's how these new performance expectations are really reshaping curriculum and requiring those creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, because just what I described looking out the classroom window would require a student to create sort of an explanation for what's happening, and then perhaps evaluate too the different elements and analyze the parts and their interactions. And we could actually, if you start to picture multiple children looking out the window, they may be creating different models and evaluating and analyzing them differently, and there you could actually have dialogue going on, okay, between these different models and what students are creating and how they're evaluating and analyzing. In order to engage in that, it requires remembering what a plant or animal is, understanding how plants and animals interact, and applying that information to what you see out the window, but it's just not sufficient, okay, to stop at that level of applying. So in order, anytime you think about next generation curriculum, you have to think about this divide that happens between district admin and teacher student in that next generation classroom. And really, that curriculum is something that is developed or purchased or set at a district level, or at least at a school level, and it of course is informed by teachers. But it's important that it's set at a school or district level because it's the teacher that has to make, basically take that curriculum and bring it to life in the classroom in the form of student experience. So the teachers are the ones who are essentially managing the lab. They're the ones setting the expectation. They're the ones coaching. They're the ones helping meet student needs and help, overcome the barriers that are there for individual students. It's incredibly skillful. It's a role that at this point in time, only a human can play, and only really a skillful teacher can play. And so that interaction, that environment, is what shapes how students interact with the standards. Okay, so think about the curriculum as translating the standards into supports for the experience, and teachers as actually translating that experience into student learning outcomes, okay, by managing that inquiry environment. And so the student learning outcomes is really the result of how students interact to develop and use the content, how they are challenged in their level of skill, and I would define that as the rigor. Okay, does the level of challenge exceed the level of skill? If it does, it's rigorous. If it doesn't, it's not. And so if in that rigorous environment, students begin to develop, they actually learn, and they are able to produce evidence of learning, which is what we see in the evidence statements, which we're going to get to here in a second. Under the previous standards, you would see things that were focused all on content. Okay, so back to my ecosystems example, students learning what voles eat and what organisms eat voles. You'd also find a lot of resources that teach misconceptions. And when students develop a framework of understanding for concepts, it's much harder for a misconception to last, because any particular concept has multiple connections, and when you make multiple connections, you tend to dispel myths. The downside of it, though, is that if your resources teach myths, then you potentially propagate a myth or connect it to many different areas. So one example I'll give you that irks me pretty deeply that you can find for yourself is the shaving cream clouds. So if you just Google shaving cream cloud experiment, I'll put that in there because that's what makes it science, shaving cream cloud experiment, you'll see all of these teacher-created resources, as well as folks at higher education institutions around the country who will take your well-earned money, hard-earned money, to teach you how to teach misconceptions through shaving cream cloud experiments. And the idea here is, somebody put together this thing that they call an experiment, which is not actually an experiment, where you put shaving cream on top of water and then you put some food coloring on it, and that is supposed to mimic rain and how raindrops form and so on and so forth, the water cycle. However, nothing could be further from the truth, because the water cycle relies on thermal energy and change of phase of matter. So basically you go from a liquid form of matter to a gas with the help of heat, and then as that gas cools, it condensates and forms clouds, and as that condensation gathers, those water droplets become heavy enough that they make their way back to the surface of Earth. There's no condensation, there's no heat, there's no convection, there's nothing about this that mirrors reality. And here's one of the alarming things, is that most children, if you ask them as in early childhood, where rain comes from, they will tell you it comes from holes in the clouds. And if you take a look at what you see here, it looks like the rain, which is the food coloring, is coming through holes in the clouds, which is the shaving cream. So what you have is something that's not an experiment, which is teaching a misconception, which is actually reinforcing a common misconception. And because under a traditional model of instruction, everything's done through these demonstrations, and that it's often a once and done and disconnected and not part of a framework, you have to be very, very careful about the resources and how they connect. And that's why I bring up the different levels of resources. You see, a mastery-ready resource is aimed at students who have developed a framework of content, knowledge, and skills such that they can develop and use that content and those skills in order to answer any question or solve any problem. That's what mastery readiness is. Performance readiness is below that. Okay, it's insufficient for mastery. What performance readiness is all about is learning how to carry out a task in order to find a piece of data. So in the traditional rock and mineral kit that you might find, you'll see that there's different rocks and minerals, and students learn how to perform the task of scratching, different surfaces to find out how hard a rock or mineral is. That's performance readiness. Even below that, you find things like textbooks that are knowledge-ready resources that just explain all about what scientists have discovered or engineers have solved. And at the bottom of the rung, bottom tier is the resources you find from museums or from companies that do, awareness activities, right? You go to a museum and there's all pictures on the wall and there's text on the wall and there's some buttons you can push and there are, the plastic shapes and things that are there. But at the end of the day, what students walk away from an awareness-ready resource is something very basic, like engineers solve problems, or scientists ask questions, or blueberries are blue, only on the skin. And I'm not sure if that's true. I'll have to look that up. But at the end of the day, they walk away with just a little tidbit. Okay? So awareness is just being aware enough to sort of raise your hand and identify something. Knowledge is knowing about something. Performance is sort of the ability to carry out a task, but mastery is like higher order thinking. It requires all these things, but it acts at a much higher level because its expectation and focus is on analyzing a scenario that's novel, not the result of direct instruction, and being able to pull on your knowledge and pull on your skills to be able to do what's necessary to come to an evidence-based solution or conclusion about that scenario. Okay, so how do you know if the resources that you have in your class, whether they're old ones, new ones, the ones you just purchased, whatever, are actually well aligned? I'm going to point you to these two key resources, which we help make available. They are actually developed by Achieve. They are part of this next generation framework of implementation for states. So the first one I would recommend you take a look at are the 5 key school and district pivots needed for alignment, which is part of the PEEC alignment guide, which is performance evaluation criteria for sort of the district level curriculum system. Okay, so think about that as what's going on at a grade level in the district. The next thing is what is actually happening within science units and lessons. That's the EQUIP rubric. And I'll tell you, the old 3-unit-a-year model of curriculum is, from grade 1 and beyond is really not appropriate under these new standards because the recommended implementation is integrated. It's not just earth science 1 year, not just life science another year. It's actually all earth science, life science, physical science, technology, engineering being integrated within the same year so you can paint a big picture. And there's very specific elements of lessons and units that need to be there for curriculum to really be in alignment. So take a look at the EQUIP rubric as well. And by the way, this is how KnowAtom aligns its own curriculum and professional development resources, making them grade specific and intentionally nurturing September through June, is with this actual criteria itself. So, our clients are running in the field with aligned materials thanks to the new standards, but also we can prove that it's aligned because of these rubrics and guidelines and also the evidence statements. And I'm going to get to that right now. So the way that this sort of comes together, these performance expectations are really all about defining the expectations and evidence of what students should be able to perform as a result of classroom instruction. Okay, as a result of their classroom experience. The performance expectations are not once and done tasks. Okay, and they are not literally what a student has to perform. They're sort of the spirit of what you have to perform, in the sense of if you think about driving a car, you know, the spirit of what you have to perform is, you know, stopping and turning and, you know, driving the speed limit and all these sort of things. But the context is it is you know, lawful operation of a vehicle on the streets of your city or town. Okay, so there's lots of different contexts. There's by the corner store, there's down by the theater, there's, you know, getting onto the highway and getting off the highway. Those are all of the variables that, you know, you can't teach, that, you know, you need the knowledge and the skills to be able to navigate. And so these new standards are exactly that. They're saying students need to be able to develop the knowledge and skills so that they can navigate an infinite number of situations. Okay, that's why the standards are not tasks. So if you look across, and I'm going to use our curriculum as an example, first grade, we start at kindergarten and go all the way through 8th grade, but what I'm about to say would apply pre-K all the way through grade 12, is that really in any particular grade level, it's important that the curriculum is grade level specific and that it is painting a big picture narrative so that concepts and skills are scaffolding from one unit to the next. So you can't do, you know, you can't do a unit at the beginning of the year or the end of the year. It actually has to happen in a specific order. That's the way these standards are designed. Concepts, you know, some concepts precede other concepts because of the actual nature of science and the nature of engineering. The other thing is that you'll see that they cross all content areas, the different strands, and that they integrate engineering as part of science. So it's learning scientific knowledge and then applying it to solve problems and identify problems. And then doing so with increasing sophistication in different contexts from one grade level to the next. So that if you have a child who enters in grade 3 without exposure to grade 1 or grade 2, they still get exposure to all those standards. They still get an opportunity to connect up with their peers and to learn those performance expectations so that when they are held accountable on their grade 4 or grade 5 testing at a state level, that they are well prepared to demonstrate their understanding at a mastery level. And so you'll see, you know, you go through the year, but then from one year to the next, okay, all the way up through middle school. If you were to look at any one of these units, okay, so I'll pick middle school now. So a unit is about a month's worth of content. And you can, if you're looking for examples of what NGSS aligned, or even if you're from an adaptive state like Massachusetts or West Virginia, we have special curriculum for adaptive states, but we also, our NGSS curriculum is for California as well as all of the NGSS adoptive states. You'll see on our website, if you go to knowatom.com/curriculum, that you can download the first unit of every grade level, and you can see what a month's worth of content is from a teacher's perspective in the teacher's unit and from a student's perspective in the student reading. Okay, and what you'll see in there is really how you set the stage to be able to jump into the year and be able to get to a point of full release of responsibility and from one sort of unit to the next. So those units for teachers are pretty significant. They have a lot of different parts. They have teacher background. They have vocabulary for the students. They have how to hold a Socratic dialogue, the areas you want to probe for, and then where you want checkpoints and how students should be engaging to plan investigations. So if you were to look at one of these units, what you're going to see, again, use sort of a 5th grade to 8th grade type model, is you're going to see nonfiction reading, then Socratic dialogue, then students breaking into small teams to plan their investigations, and then they carry out those plans that they created in order to gather data and form claim, evidence, and reasoning model of conclusions, which they can then share out kind of have a peer review in sort of a Socratic sense, and then transition to the next lesson or next unit. Okay, so when you think about a lesson in these new science standards, a lesson is really not about one day. A lesson is about a group of standards. It's about a group of experiences that take place over multiple days. So in a middle school, this might be a 5-day week. Okay, so this is kind of a cadence or the arc of a 5-day week where you would see students for 55 minutes a day, let's say. Okay, at early elementary and elementary level, so early elementary, you need to be getting an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours a week in total. Okay, that's what these new standards require. If you're going from grade 3 to grade 5, you're looking at 2.5 hours to 3 hours a week, not as one solid chunk of time, but collectively time on learning over the course of the week. That's what you're looking for to be able to accomplish what's there. Okay, and a lot of the low-level tools that unfortunately it's kind of basic administrative tools that people have adapted over time that aren't really effective. The idea that you can write your standard on the board and that you should read that aloud and so on, it's obsolete now. Picture yourself writing all of this on the board before class and reading it aloud to students when you only have them for 40 minutes. I mean, that is a traditional tool for principals to manage teachers, and that's part of the problem with not having good curriculum, because if everybody is on their own in the classroom to try and create curriculum, then every classroom is doing something different. So a principal walks into a classroom, they have no idea what they're looking at. So what do? They ask teachers to write their standard on the board. So if they drop into your class for 5 minutes, they read the standard and they look at what the kids are doing and they try to make a judgment call as to whether that's appropriate or not. Okay, that's got to go away. That is like, that's too basic. If that's the way you manage your school as a principal, it's too basic. It's too basic to provide children with the level of nurturing and the high quality experience that they deserve to be able to develop those critical thinking skills and actually to be able to apply them in other disciplines as well as perform well on the next generation assessments. So what needs to happen here is that all of that should be documented in the curriculum itself so that as a principal comes in, they understand, hey, all my third grade teachers are in Unit 2 on lesson 1 or 2, fine, but I know that, this is what the district expectation is for vocabulary. These are the kind of experiences that are going on. This is our methodology. How is the teacher executing that? How is the teacher meeting student needs? How is the teacher helping students interpret the expectations and actually get from their current level of skill to the skill that's expected of them. Okay, that's how a principal should be coming in and managing the classroom. And so there's a lot more on principals and administrators to get with the program, but on the flip side, you need a program to get with. So, that's the rub. Okay, how do you know that your program is producing the kind of learning outcomes that you're looking for, or what should your curriculum be aimed at? Well, the nice thing about these new standards is that we have the observable outcomes. Okay, this is what evidence of student learning is for this particular performance expectation. Okay, a student should be able to be observed by the end of the grade level, if it's a grade level specific standard, demonstrating what you see here. Okay, so this is difficult to explain. So if the performance expectation is that a student will develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment, I should be able to give them that context. Hey, the picture of outside the window in my classroom. And a student should be able to describe the phenomena that's going on in that environment, be able to describe the movement of matter that's going on in that picture, and to be able to view it as an ecosystem, to be able to identify the different components that make it an ecosystem, that describe the relationship between the parts. Okay, so it's going to include matter, plants, animals, decomposers, the environment itself. It's also going to be looking at that producer, consumer, decomposer, primary and secondary consumer type relationships. Okay, and how it's not just energy, but it's matter that's cycling and flowing. And also, because it's cycling and flowing, being able to kind of think about this in terms of the bigger picture. what are the effects of changing the number of species or eliminating a species entirely from a food chain or a food web? What's the effect that will have on other organisms and on the ecosystem as a whole? So you can see that this is much more nuanced. It's much more tightly knit than just knowing that plants are producers. Okay, that's insufficient. A student needs to be able to be observed producing evidence of their learning from the classroom in the form of what I've just described to you by the end of that grade level. If they can do that, then they've mastered the performance expectation. If they can't, then they are not proficient, and that's how it is. And there's gradients here, but the bottom line is that this is not something that you can treat like a box where you check off matter, check off plants, check off animals. It actually has to be part of this dynamic inquiry environment. So I would highly recommend that you take a look at nextgenerationscience.org/evidence-statements, and you look at the evidence statements for all of the different standards so that you understand really the expectations of what curriculum produces in student learning. So here at KnowAtom, what we do is we not only look at the performance expectation, but we look at the environment of that our curriculum supports and is creating, and we make sure that that environment is almost like a labyrinth, that it's causing students to have to go through this labyrinth of learning and experiencing what it is to productively struggle, and produce all of these different learning outcomes in context. And we do so multiple times over multiple years and in multiple different circumstances. So that way there, if a student doesn't get it the first time, that's fine. We should expect that, right? Mastery is not a one-time thing. But over the course of time, the student gets tighter and tighter and tighter understanding and more nuanced applications, and so they're able to really demonstrate performance of the expectations as defined by the evidence statements. And so that's how you go kind of full circle back to what you see here, that student experience. The labyrinth that challenges students in context is what gives us student learning, and that student learning is evidenced by students' ability to attack a novel scenario. Again, the student experience is not the result of direct instruction, and the scenario is not the result of direct instruction. So that gives us confirmation that students have truly mastered the standards through the curriculum, okay? So how do you actually produce that? Well, K-12 curriculum development process or redevelopment process that you have to think about is integrating not only all the standards but the ELA and math components. If you're from a Common Core state, it's a little easier for you because these standards were developed with math and ELA Common Core in mind. They line up with the Common Core expectations very well, and they allow you to cross over very easily from science into the Common Core technical subject standards, nonfiction reading and writing, and all of the science and engineering practices very closely mirror the Common Core math practices. So it's really, one hand washing the other here. The curriculum has to involve constant and consistent opportunity to engage in those higher order thinking skills, and really the requirement that students engage in them on an everyday basis, and it has to support this next generation model of inquiry. So there's kind of three components that make up curriculum. It's the curriculum itself, it's the professional development, and it's the materials. A lot of the next generation science standards really, there's no better way to engage students in the learning than hands-on. And I don't mean you make something and show it to them and then they go make it for themselves, or there's a make by number, or there's something you pull out of a box and they try to work with it. But in fact, that students are in an environment where the curriculum creates an opportunity for them to plan their approach to a problem or their approach to a question and actually carry it out hands-on and see, as scientists and engineers, what the result of their planning yields, because that means data. So that's what that STEM learning environment's all about. in order for teachers to get to that place, to make the transition from a traditional model of instruction to next generation model of instruction, there is some professional development that's most often required. I have not seen an environment where professional development wasn't required. At minimum, to understand not only the resources, so if I use KnowAtom as an example, the resources that are within KnowAtom, because KnowAtom is very much integrated. All of the supports are there. There's no supplements. There's no anything. It's all there for the teacher in alignment with the student, in alignment September to June, and from one grade to the next. But teachers need to understand how to operate that, what it looks like in the classroom, and what to expect in terms of setting student expectations and the kind of challenges students are going to run into, and how to manage those expectations over time. So in order to do that, whether you use something like KnowAtom or not, you got to start with an understanding of the standards, and also really at a basic level how your district communicates and what's necessary to scale something, not just in one classroom but across the entire district. Because just because it makes sense to one teacher, this is what a teacher's always done, doesn't mean that everybody's going to understand what this teacher is doing. And that's kind of the problem that you'll often see with teacher-created resources, is that Mrs. Johnson did this, and that was great for Mrs. Johnson, but nobody can replicate what Miss Johnson did, or nobody was willing to go to Walmart or send notes home and spend all their weekend cutting up bottles, so it doesn't happen. So at the basis, it's understanding human organizational behavior and being able to communicate that. The next level is really a deep understanding of the standards themselves, and nuanced understanding of each dimension, how they connect. And beyond that, it's how those connections articulate vertically, how the performance expectations are networked, and then starting to work that into a unit framework, which then leads to lessons, content experience, and materials. So that is what forms curriculum, but what's beneath the curriculum is all much, much more, right? So if you create that, and so this is what KnowAtom does. KnowAtom's has this continuous feedback loop where we are constantly monitoring teacher feedback, whether it's direct feedback, whether it is surveys, that sort of a thing, but also through field observations, through support tickets, whatever it is, so that our copyrights actually update almost yearly, and so people who are under contract with us always have up-to-date, well-aligned curriculum that's the latest and greatest. And so while they're under contract each year, those updates are sent to the district. Everybody's gets their updates and so on and so forth, and they're good to go. And any materials that are shipped are updated in an alignment too. So whether or not you have someone like KnowAtom engaged in that, or you're doing it on your own, that needs to be part of your process, because if you've never done something before, a classroom that does it for 30 years has only done it 30 times. So that's pretty limited experience in the scope of experience. In our case, in any given year we have thousands and thousands of students interacting with something, and so all of those classrooms and all of those students, that feedback flows back up to us, and so we have literally thousands of data points to kind of reflect back on and make changes so that we get better quickly. And that's how over the last 12 years we've even been able to be in alignment so quickly. So how do you support that for a teacher? I'm just going to take a quick pass through this, and then I'll take questions here. So you see, this is, if you were to download a unit, this is Unit 7. You would be downloading a Unit 1 off of our website. If you want to see something else, reach out to Karen, and she'll give you some access or find a way to help support you there. But what is the progression of lessons in this month? What's the overview? What are the objectives for mastery? How are the standards? What are the standards that are here, and how are they unpacked within each lesson? What are not only the different dimensions of that are being applied, the disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts, but what are the science and engineering practices that are in each lesson and expected of students? What's the vocabulary that's in the student's reader? I'm not showing any pictures of readers today, but you can download a reader online too and see. What's the vocabulary? Consistent vocabulary is important. And the quality vocabulary is important, quality definitions. You know, I can't go into that in detail now, but it really makes a difference. Mass is one thing, and it is not something else. Gravity is something specific. It is not something else, okay? And to mix different concepts like mass and gravity and say, oh, it's all the same, is actually teaching a misconception. So having vocabulary that's age appropriate, supporting the curriculum and so on, and is actually what students are going to use as they develop their plans is important. Having background for the teacher where all of those concepts are used in context, super important. Having that lesson, that 5, segment lesson progression that I showed you earlier, kind of arc from nonfiction reading all the way through students forming evidence-based conclusions starts right here, and with an objective and different materials. So these are the consumables and durables that we provide. The preparation that's required, okay, and this is really looking at teachers getting ready for class, read your lesson, set up pickup stations. Here's, what you want to think about in terms of having the visuals ready. And then where to probe in that Socratic dialogue after that student reading has taken place, okay, bringing the visuals into it, how to structure those plans and what the expectations are of students in that environment. What does a student lab look like? And this is a middle school example. Okay, and then also assessments. So you have assessments in the form of investigations that students have partial responsibility over, different segments, but you also have these full student planned investigations, which are both assessments. But then you have things like the reading comprehension questions, you have vocabulary checks, multiple choice and open response, and then you have concept checks, which require students to either take what they've learned, generalize it, and apply it to a multiple choice question that is not the result of direct instruction, or to analyze a scenario and actually answer a series of questions related to that scenario that tease out all the elements of the standard itself, those 3 different dimensions, the foundation boxes. And then, of course, having the answer keys available for teachers so that they understand why this is the correct answer. Well, first of all, what the correct answer is, why that's the correct answer, and why it's not the others. Having support in terms of the connections to ELA and math if you're a Common Core state. Okay, so that's how we do it here. Having concept maps so teachers can see how all the concepts are connected in the unit, and having support for differentiated instruction, because again, any teacher that has mainstreamed special ed students or ELLs, English language learners, are going to need to deal with some differentiation, and so it's important to have that for them, specifically when it comes to understanding how to isolate elements of a standard and even engage in portfolio assessment, because a lot of states, what they're doing now is really looking to, if a student has a severe IEP status, then basically they're under a portfolio assessment, which is kind of alternative assessment to kind of paper, pencil, or screen touching that is part of the new tests. So anyway, so student learning, what it looks like in the classroom, this is what it looks like. Students engaging in their own ideas with a partner, having to learn collaborative skills, taking the plans that they have, making them come to life, whether it's on the floor of the classroom, in the lunchroom, outside the door of the classroom. We have kids that are doing this in Arabic in northern Iraq. They don't even have tables. They work on the floor. These are some 3rd, 4th grade levels kids. And yet you still see the same kind of engagement, okay? None of this is staged. This is just kids being kids, all right? But it's key that, again, it's this interplay where the classroom is an environment where students are scientists, and that every element of that arc from nonfiction reading forward has a purpose. So Socratic dialogue, students breaking into teams, being the scientist or engineer, and then coming back together to present and evaluate claims as a group, because there are going to be different approaches. That's part of having authentic inquiry. And the last bit, yes, this is what student learning is going to look like. You're not going to see kids in rows. Evidence of learning is really can a student be observed producing what is required in the evidence statements in a novel context? Because if they can, that is mastery readiness. If they can, the curriculum brought them to mastery readiness or really supported the teacher in bringing the student to mastery readiness levels. Okay, and that's the key. You know, the curriculum sets up the teacher sets up the student, and the student, by engaging, actually develops the skills and the content knowledge to be able to generalize, synthesize, evaluate a novel context, and actually be observed producing evidence of their learning. Okay, so I'm going to take questions now. I will hang around. I know we're a couple minutes over. The key takeaways here are that standards define the minimum performance expectations of a student with understanding. They apply in many contexts, really infinite contexts. They require the science and engineering practice skills, disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts to happen in connection with each other simultaneously. And that curriculum is a context. It really defines the context where students develop and use those three dimensions in order to have an experience performing the expectations of the standards, okay? And the teacher is the skillful manager of that environment, not the sage on the stage. And the reason you see those asterisks, it's that this is not a once and done approach, okay? And that curriculum is intentional, it's nurturing, and it's consistent across a grade level in a district, okay? It doesn't do anybody, students first and foremost, but teachers as well, any benefit to have them kind of out on their own, freelancing, fending for themselves, because otherwise everybody, in that scenario, everybody's on a different page. So here's what I'd like to point you to if you're looking for where to find these resources, where to reach out for support and all of that. Okay, KnowAtom.com/equip or KnowAtom.com/peak will bring you to those rubrics and guidelines for district level, unit, and lesson level resources. If you want to see what such resources look like that are well aligned, go to KnowAtom.com/curriculum and download a lesson 1, which is about a month's worth of curriculum for a grade level of your choice. Now there's a lot there. There's no cover pages. There's no professional development with it. So you're going to have to kind of work to understand what's there, but we can make it easier for you. If you want to reach out to Karen, she is also a teacher who works here with us at KnowAtom. She's a curriculum specialist. You can reach her by telephone at 617-475-3475, extension 2001, or by email at kpeake, K-P-E-A-K-E, at KnowAtom.com, or you're welcome to reach out to me, fvigent@KnowAtom.com as well. If you go to KnowAtom.com/resources, you'll see we have a ton of webinars and ebooks and different parts too that kind of help you unpack, evaluate, and so on. But that curriculum example, I think, will help show you from a teacher's perspective. Everything that's in the teacher's unit is teacher level. It's adult level. Okay, if you download also the student reader, you're going to see something at a student's level, which is just their nonfiction reading piece. And it's what happens in between those, which is the student's planning and the student piece. The last bit I promised was a little bit of data. So I will show you some data here that, again, we've been working on this stuff for a long time. There's a reason we've been able to do that is that Next Generation Science Standards didn't just appear. I think some people think that it did. Next Generation Science Standards have been in development since 2009, and even prior to that. I think there's an argument to say that they have been developed, and there has been documentation that was released that certainly we have been engaging in our development process here over years, and it has been producing great benefits. Here's some examples from New Hampshire where our site became #1 in the state. And also, you know, the state was #1 in the country at the point too, and we were outperforming different years, you know, upwards of 20% over state average. And when you look into the subgroups, you can see really how, you know, we were outperforming the state. We're in purple and yellow, and the state was in pink and blue across all of the domain areas that were tested. And that was, an example from New Hampshire. I could show you some others from urban districts in places like Massachusetts, where the district average is 50% advanced and proficient. Over the course of 2.5 years, this group added 51 points, despite being 72% low income and 35% ELL students. They all, were up in the 80s, 87% advanced and proficient. Now, why these corrections? Change in principal, change in teachers, but they don't fall all the way back. Okay. Other examples. This district, this school, double-digit gains in the first year, and again, maintaining them over time. You could, in advanced and proficient, you can see the reduction in needs improvement and warning consistently low. Again, the average was 50% for the state. Likewise, there's another. Okay, and these guys, by the way, they're basically 80% advanced and proficient. This is number 1 in the state of Massachusetts. Try to give you some apples to apples comparison. They, again, got double-digit gains, basically 90% advanced and proficient students. Okay, this is one of the lowest middle schools in the state, and over the course of 2 years, 2.5 years, they added 24 points to their advanced and proficient, going from just 4% proficient to 28%. And look at the reduction in the warning failing category, which many states would call below basic. Okay, going from 54 to 27%. Okay, and hope, continuing and so on. If you look at the demographics of that school, you can see here, well, first of all, the improvements in data, but you can see basically 95% low income, 97% high needs, 64% first language is not English. And they're basically meeting or closely approaching all of the state level benchmarks for each subgroup, whether it's white, black, Hispanic, Latino, students with disabilities, low income, and so on. So I'll take some questions now. If you haven't had your question answered by Karen in the meantime, I'm going to grab onto that. I'll throw this information back up there for you while I grab these questions. Okay. So try to combine these into a few. I'll try to take 2 or 3 of these. So let's see here. Some folks are asking about whether evidence statements are success criteria in the world of standards-based grading and so on. I would say that it's an element of success criteria. It's certainly not the entirety of the success criteria. So, if you just take that literally, the criteria for success, a student is not successful purely because they can produce, like I said earlier, that a plant, absorbs energy from the sun and that it's a producer, which somebody may look at an evidence statement and say that that's what it implies. And those people make the mistake of thinking that if they can check off all of the things that are in the evidence statements, then of course students are going to be successful. That means that they're successful, and that's not really the case. So a student needs to be able to understand, let's use the example that a plant is a producer in order to be successful. But in order for the student to be successful, they have to be able to engage the science and engineering practices as skills to develop and use the content knowledge in order to produce those outcomes, those observable outcomes. So the success criteria extends to the science and engineering practices as internalized skills, and also the necessary content knowledge and essentially the understanding of the expectation that as a student I need to develop and use what I know in order to understand this context, which is novel to me, and produce evidence of my learning, which is what you would see stated in the evidence statements. So I hope that makes it a little bit clearer, but I wouldn't disagree with you, but I don't think that it's entirely fair to say that evidence statements are 100% of the success criteria. Other things that we haven't covered that are in here. Some folks are asking questions about the learning environment. So how is it that the learning environment is organized, and what is it that should be expected of the students? So the learning environment should be structured really around student thinking. And so it's constantly trying to develop the student's thinking in the student's own voice. So what you're doing is that you're using nonfiction reading to get students to articulate concept to concept, concept to self, and concept to world connections with what they've read, and to do so in the context of some kind of a Socratic dialogue. The reason we recommend and talk about Socratic dialogue is that Socratic dialogue doesn't give an answer, but it solicits an answer by asking a student or requiring a student to reflect, critically reflect, okay, and reflect really in the concept, the self, and the world context if it's done, if this facilitation is done properly. Now you can use inner circle, outer circle techniques. You could do as a group Socratic dialogue, which is one of my favorites. But nonetheless, that's kind of how it begins to build purpose and scaffold up from just something that's a read aloud perhaps to something that is personally connected. And then what you see here is that students are learning where they're going in a lesson, or the direction that students are navigating to is the problem or question that the group decides to tackle as scientists or engineers. And so in our case, this is one of the things that's tough for developing curriculum, that this is essentially the goal of the class is to answer the question or to solve the problem. Okay, so in our curriculum, we actually have problems and questions that are there, but we don't give those to students. What we do is we create an environment where a teacher can skillfully lead the students to that, but through questioning. So if we have these materials available and we have this connection that we've made and that connection that we made, what's a question, what's a problem that we could answer or solve as scientists or engineers, given that this is the tools and materials that we have available? What do you think? And start crowdsourcing some of those ideas. And then that problem or question acts as the goal. That is what we are going to. How do we get there is the next question. Well, we get there using what we know, and by developing it using the science and engineering practices. Oh, but here's an issue. The next generation science standards are silent on the specifics of the process. This is something that KnowAtom has developed extremely well over the last 10 years, is the scientific process and the engineering design process. When you look at the totality of next generation science standards documentation, you will see process referenced but not really defined. So the difference between practice and process is that the practices are the skills necessary to engage in science or engineering. The process is how a scientist can go from a question to an evidence-based conclusion, or how an engineer can go from identifying a problem to an evidence-based technology. Okay, so it's a logical framework. Now, some people will say, well, and unfortunately, these folks tend to have less experience with how STEM industry actually operates and how science and engineering actually happens in the real world. But scientists and engineers all use process. Process is methodology. So that's where you might have heard about the scientific method or the engineering design process. Okay? every firm and every scientist and every engineer is going to have a slightly different take on the process that they use. But basically, there's a framework of logic that gets applied to questions. For instance, when you ask a question, the very next thing you do is you try to research it. What do other people know about this question? What's relevant to it? Has the question been answered? And you take that knowledge and you use it to inform your hypothesis if the question hasn't already been answered. And your hypothesis is a hypothetical answer to that question, which is testable. It's something that you can actually test as to whether or not it's true or false. Okay, and how do you know if it's true or false? Well, as a result of your experiment, it will either be supported by the data or not supported. And you may end up with an inconclusive outcome. That's fine. That's sort of a third option. So this process is the framework by which students learn how to answer questions or how to solve problems and how to do so as scientists and engineers and actually form a plan. Okay, so that's how students learn to form a plan, and then students actually carry those plans out hands-on. They use the materials, they carry out their plans, they gather their data, and then they form an evidence-based conclusion out of it. That's that claim evidence reasoning. But it actually goes beyond claim evidence reasoning. It's question hypothesis claim evidence reasoning. Okay? And so as students are collaborating, that's one of the 4 C's, those 21st century skills, is collaboration. They and their partner have to agree on their approach to a question or problem. They may be different than all the other teams in the class. That's fine, but they have to agree, and they form their plan, they carry it out, they come to their conclusion, and then as a group we come back together and discuss our approaches and our outcomes and think critically about this and reflect on it in light of what we know. So think about it as a question or a problem with a compass, and the compass is the process, and the skills in order to engage in the process are the science and engineering practices. Okay, so sorry for the long answer, but it's very much how this operates, and it's a big gap for folks right now because people are filling in the process component of this, the how, with these draconian, step-by-step, hand-it-to-the-kid processes, or follow by number or make by number, all these sort of things which they deem tools which actually defeat challenge, they defeat rigor, and they actually defeat the purpose and the opportunity for skills to develop in these students. The last question I'll take has to do with special education students and English language learners. So, and also a last piece in terms of feedback. So in that environment, where students are developing their plans, there are checkpoints. So it's not about lack of accountability, it's about full release of responsibility with checkpoints for accountability where students have an incentive to move along the process, actually come to the teacher, present their idea, get some quick feedback, and move along. That's key. If students don't really get feedback in the moment at regular intervals, which they can then incorporate in the process, then they end up unsuccessful, which that's okay if you're unsuccessful, but they end up wasting time on learning because they end up kind of flying blind, thinking that they're meeting an expectation without actually knowing. And so that feedback is important. But again, the role of the teacher is as coach and not as somebody who is validating right, wrong, or saying that you need to do it this way. What they're saying is something like, what's your hypothesis? Oh, that's your hypothesis. Well, can a hypothesis end in a question mark? And if a student doesn't know, then they can show them, say, well, let's take a look. Here it is. What does it say? Oh, okay, a hypothesis needs to end in a period because it's a declarative statement that we are testing it as either true or false. Does yours end in that? No. Okay, so I need you to go back. This is a U-turn and work with your partner and turn this question into a statement that you can test. Go. 5 minutes, and that's the kind of environment that you create for accountability. But the special education and ELL question that I'll end on here. So for students who are in special education programs, if they are mainstreamed, let's start with that context, basically it's just whatever's on their IEP applies in the context of science. That's it. Okay, if they have access to a scribe, if they have access to a Kurzweil reader, if they are allowed to do their lab plans on an iPad instead of on, a paper notebook, all acceptable. Okay, the goal of an IEP is to help remove barriers to grade level mastery of skills, content, and cross-cutting concepts. The goal of an IEP is not to remove challenge that is necessary to develop a skill, or to remove skill, or to remove content. Okay? Unfortunately, many people have decided, and I blame leveled readers for this. Okay? Many people have decided that instead of challenging their limits, that they should limit their challenges. Okay? And the reality is that challenge creates a space for growth. What we don't want is insurmountable barriers. And that's what an IEP's job is, to identify insurmountable barriers for a child and give you clues as to what those are and how to remove them. Okay? And what we find, particularly with KnowAtom's curriculum, is that that it's not entirely, it's not a textbook. So for a student who has a language-based learning disability, if the path to mastery is entirely literacy-based in the form of a textbook, then that child has a single path to mastery, and it's entirely encumbered by their language-based learning disability. But in the case of KnowAtom, we have some nonfiction reading, but it's just a springboard to dialogue. So now we have an opportunity to learn through auditory modalities, and that's just a springboard into kinesthetic learning. As we plan investigations in text, sure, but we also carry them out hands-on, and then we gather that data and reflect back on it. So we're crossing all of these different modes. So it's a very common piece of feedback that we hear that, wow, not my best student has turned out to be my best student, and I never would have expected it. You should see, they're terrible in this and terrible in that, and you should see their IEP, but wow, they really shine when it comes to science. Same thing is true for ELL students. So ELL students are essentially, you can almost think of them in some respects as students with a very special case of a language-based learning disability. Oftentimes they can't read, they can't write, and they may or may not even be verbal in a language. So what do you do with that? Well, if a student isn't verbal, anything certainly that we have, but others have, I hope, you would treat as you would in a substantially separate classroom, and the teacher would be translating, or it would be translated for students, and then you would sort of scaffold out, key vocabulary that you want to do in English and sort of help students over the fence that way. What's nice is that students are verbal first, and so the opportunity here is to engage in group think, to plan investigations together as a group, and then to break down into smaller groups where students carry out those plans that you developed as a group themselves, and thereby engaging verbally and kinesthetically with the content, seeing these things firsthand. And what we've seen come back in state reports, anytime state evaluators have gone into districts, and we've gotten reports back about this, is that the student engagement is off the charts, because and also the kind of unique tool that KnowAtom is, or hands-on learning is, for students for language acquisition, is that oftentimes that you might have students in a classroom who are seeing something for the first time and they have no word for it in their native language, which means that the first time they acquire a word for something is in English. Okay, so it might be a word like eruption, or it might be reaction, or it might be matter or gravity, okay, or gram. It could be any of these sort of things. But nonetheless, science and the kind of personal nature of it being hands-on, and the connection that students have verbally, kinesthetically, visually with what's happening, all combine to make it something that is very tangible for ELLs. So that said, I will let that be the last question. If you have others, you have my contact information. I'd be happy to respond to you personally by email. If you have a question or you've downloaded a unit, if you do download a unit, I highly recommend reaching out to Karen by telephone or by email. Again, her telephone number is 617-475-3475, and her extension is 2010. She's in the Eastern time zone, which is East Coast, and her email is PAKE@KnowAtom.com. The reason I say reach out to her is that she can help walk you through what's there and to understand how it works. And also, if you're trying to understand how that fits in the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish, she's really great at helping walk you through, what it might not be useful for as well as what it might be useful for. So that said, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your willingness to hang on, to ask so many questions. And also, if you are a principal, a teacher, a lead teacher, if you're anybody in the process of impacting student learning in the classroom and the next generation science standards are something that you are making an attempt to move from a traditional model to a next generation model of instruction and inquiry, or whether you're already there but just looking for excellent resources to be able to make that sustainable and scalable and reliable in your district, we really love to work with leaders. We do have all of those solutions available, and there's something that you can start with, very soon, as soon as you're really ready. So we'd be happy to have that conversation with you if that is appropriate. Thank you again for your time. Again, I'm Francis Vigent, and wish you a great rest of your day. Bye now.